Welcome back to the Food Forest. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to kind of channel some of the winter style series of videos in this one. We're going to get into some larger topics. The goal for this video is really to change the way that people think. Today's video we're going to talk about a few key concepts. We're going to talk about energy flows, and we're going to talk about how humans are both endo and exosomatic at the same time, and where do we define what a human is? Where do we define what life is? We're going to talk about interconnectivity and relationships with nature and how that's been disjointed in the past, 100 years. We're going to end it on an example that I just experienced in real life that kind of got me thinking about this on the drive home from work. And it's an example of an organism essentially cannibalizing itself. That organism's us. Now, some aspects of this video are going to seem kind of hippy-dippy and spiritual, but stay with me. If you like that stuff, you're going to love this video. If you don't really like that stuff, I'm approaching this from an engineer and physicist standpoint on energy flows. Did you know that as you age and your cells die, they're replaced with new cells? And it happens so frequently that essentially someone my age is comprised of completely different cells than I was when I was a kid. This is something that I've always found very odd, that the molecules that make up my body are completely different. I still feel like Keith, but I'm completely different from a molecular standpoint. And as I eat food like these delicious currants, which by the way are really more medicine than food. These things have like 30 times the vitamin C than blueberries. And they're just chock full of antioxidants. Now, as I eat the currant and my chemical enzymes in my digestive system breaks them apart into the individual atomic constituents and puts them into my body, that currant becomes me. I am the currant. And at what point does that current become who I am? So where does the human being's life end? If I just look at the outline of my body, my skin, I'm actually more, did you know this? I'm actually more bacterial than human by cell. If you actually count up all the cells in my body, I'm actually not as much human as I am a spaceship that carries bacteria around. And I can't exist, I can't function, I can't live without this symbiotic relationship of the organisms that make up me. The energy that I can access through the symbiosis of gut bacteria that help me digest my food is why I'm alive. Now, this is really an endosomatic way of looking at it, which is, energy flows internal to my body. Now, if I'm equally dependent on exosomatic, external to my body, relationships with energy and life, then is it really that far-fetched to say that not only am I alive because of the bacteria that I'm carrying around in my spaceship of a body, but also the interactions and relationships that I have with creatures that are outside of my body? It's this interaction with all creatures and plants that actually defines if I'm alive or not. The fruit in my food forest is covered in bacteria, and if I wash it and disinfect it, then I lose all that internalized energy that I get from eating it. I would argue that the currants that are currently sitting on the bush are actually part of who I am. I haven't eaten them yet, but I don't exist without them. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Let's look at this red currant bush. This red currant bush does not exist. It cannot survive without the actual pollinators that pollinate the currants that I'm eating. Because this currant bush cannot exist without the pollinators that provide it life, that it is not alive until it is in harmony with the pollinators that give it the ability to be alive. And this is just one of many codependent relationships in nature. These raspberries aren't alive until they're pollinated. So the pollinators are essentially a part of the raspberry. They can't exist without it. Now, as a thought experiment, on the way home, I observed something really bizarre to me. It was a grounds crew worker who was using a whippersnipper in a ditch far away from the building, just whacking down weeds. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have seen that. I would have observed it, but I wouldn't have seen it for what it is, which is essentially humanity cannibalizing itself. I was listening to Nate Hagen's The Great Simplification. It's a podcast, it's a fantastic one if you're interested in this kind of thing at all. Now, he's an ecology and economics minded person, really kind of joining those two things together, which is very rare these days, especially doing it in a scientific way, which is probably why I like him. But he has a term called the human superorganism, and it's really the societal human society superorganism. It's seeing humanity collectively as one organism that is essentially a virus destroying its own habitat. Now, I can really connect to this because this is kind of like how I define myself as this, but I'm really just a spaceship carrying around mostly bacteria. And the human collective superorganism is really just made up of a bunch of bacteria that it's carrying around. You know, bacteria being me and you and everyone else who's watching this. And we collectively make up the human superorganism. And all the choices we make and all the decisions we make, it's how we interact with all the relationships in nature. And from that perspective, seeing a society designed in a way where there's a company that's paying a subcontractor money, that's taking away from its profits, that's then paying a worker to go out and burn gasoline and their time to go around and destroy habitat for insects that are essentially important for our own survival, that are kind of like us. You can see the stupidity in some of the things we do where we're spending all of this time, resources, and energy to actually cannibalize not just nature, but cannibalizing our own very beings. Every insect that will be destroyed from the destruction of that habitat is energy that would have gone into another organism, that would have gone into eating pests off of food, that would have gone into potentially feeding somebody. And what's the driver for that? It's really just to make something look a little nicer, a little cleaner, more organized. We're literally cannibalizing ourselves, destroying our planet so that things look neat and tidy on the way out the door to the grave. Did you know that since 1970, the Earth has lost 70% of its landmass? And that number's probably way higher now because that's an old stat. Did you know that before the Industrial Revolution, that 90% of all life on Earth was wild? Only 10% of it was humans and the livestock that we run in order to survive. And did you know that over 90% of all life on Earth right now is either humans or the livestock that we run to survive and eat? We've destroyed our living world. And because we are part of the ecology, we are part of the symbiotic relationships of nature, we're actually just destroying ourselves. So now I want to talk about energy gradients, and how life self-organizes, what life is. It's this interplay between all the relationships that make up living creatures and how they organize that defines what is alive. Understanding these energy flows is going to be a big tool that you can use to build abundance in your garden. A lot of people don't realize, but every single day they sabotage their own energy flows into their systems. Now, where there's no energy, there's no life. And when there's abundant energy, there's abundant life. Life self-organizes across energy gradients. Now, the existence of energy is what brings life. Life can't exist without energy. And life self-organizes across energy gradients. And it's where we have these energy gradients that we get things like evolution happening. We get codependent relationships happening, where both organisms might benefit from each other if it means that they can harvest and extract more of that energy. So just quickly, what's an energy gradient? Think of, say, a moisture gradient from the ocean to the dry beach. And as you go from the ocean to the beach, where you have kind of wet sand slowly drying up as you get a little bit higher, you have this gradient of water. Now, gradients exist everywhere. In my food forest, there's light gradients where we have the edges of trees, where we have full shadow under the tree, we have full sun outside of the tree, and there's an energy gradient of sunlight. Plants will self-organize themselves in this energy gradient, picking to germinate in areas along that gradient where they can outcompete other plants based off of where they evolved for the last 100 million years. Now, understanding these energy flows into your system is really important because this is how we can really maximize the amount of food and life that we can grow. There's three main sources of energy that we want to tap into in a garden or a food forest. Solar light is the biggest and most important one. The more solar light that we can capture, the more energy that we're actually absorbing from the bounty of the sun that shines on our land. The second is water. However much water we can absorb before it leaves our land, we're going to have access to be able to use the photosynthesis, which needs the sunlight and the water, to make the energy. And the third is life. And this is a big one that a lot of people forget or don't even think about. It's the chemical imbued energy in the digestive tracts of all life. We're not just talking about large animals or chickens or birds or lizards or frogs. We're talking also, about bacteria and fungi and nematodes and protozoa and microarthropods. The more energy that you can attract into your food forest and system, the more abundance that you're going to have. So for example, even though we have currants here that are growing happily, we're also including things like these phlox to help bring in the insect life. The more insect life that we have in our system, they wage war on each other. And when these insects kill each other, fight, eat each other, and then pee and poo out the remains, which then worms, dung beetles, bacteria, nematodes will continue the closed loop cycle, all the detrivores. If we can bring in more insect life into our food forest systems, we'll get more abundance returned back through the fertility that they bring. Now, sometimes maximizing something like, say, water isn't even so much about maximizing the water that you bring in. That's part of it. But sometimes it's also about reducing the amount of water that you lose. So planting in dense polyculture plantings not only increases the photosynthesis that you're capturing. Look at all of these solar panels that are growing here on this swale. The swale is holding water, but also the plant leaves themselves are shading the soil level. They're providing windbreak for winds, and they're preventing any kind of evaporation out of the soils. Dense plantings, like nature does, not only increases the energy of the sun, but also maximizes the amount of water in the soil. Now, one thing that I actually stopped doing about 5 years ago was preventing animals from getting into my property. We used to have some fencing that we had up for deer and rabbits because it was frustrating when the food forest was starting that I would lose plants to these animals. But as important as I think it is to not ignore the threat of those things that can take down an early food forest, it's also really important to understand when your system transitions beyond the need for protection and benefits more from actually allowing these creatures into your system. It was around this time that I started planting clover and perennial greens specifically to actually attract rabbits into my food forest. I plant Jerusalem artichokes all around my fruit trees because deer love Jerusalem artichokes, and I would rather them eat that than eat my fruit trees. But I would rather them be in my system than not. So when I talked about the currant or the raspberry, that literally depends on, for its life, a pollinator to pollinate it so that it can spread its seed. It's this interconnectivity that a lot of religions actually touch on, specifically earth-centered religions like Native American religions or spiritual-centered religions like, say, Taoism, where the mysticism of nature is cherished and embraced. And when these spiritual ideas of oneness and interconnectivity align with the natural observations of, say, an engineer or physicist about how to maximize the energy flows in a system, and that's how you create abundance, I think that's where you can really tell that we're onto something in permaculture. So I want you to think, in what ways in your life are you sabotaging the human collective? In what ways are you sabotaging yourself? That's either by, directly controlling the way that we garden in really weird ways, having a useless ornamental lawn that could otherwise feed back into regrowing nature, or just the vast consumption of stuff that you don't really need, that the production of those things has environmental externalities that are destroying the natural world and you're implicit in. There's a statistic out there that 70% of the emissions come from just 100 companies. Not only has that stat been actually debunked, but the stat also ignores the fact that all of these companies are coal, oil, and gas companies that simply feed the demand that we provide through our voracious consumption. Life and economy self-organizes around energy gradients. And when we throw a huge energy gradient in the term of money, when we throw that giant energy gradient out there, the economy will self-organize to fulfill it. And as much as it can feel like no individual human can have an actual impact when you see some of the devastating practices that companies do, our most important contribution that we can do individually is to set and define the energy gradient that the financial world will self-organize to maximize. The best way to do that is just reduce what you're buying. If you think you want something, wait a month. If you still want it a month later, go buy it. But you'll be surprised how many things you figure, I actually don't need it anymore. Start growing some of your own food. Every single item of food that you grow that is not from a grocery store and that's grown in harmony with nature, reducing the pressure on the industrial food chain allows farmers to grow in more sustainable ways. You save money, you eat healthier food that you grew yourself, and nature rebounds because nature's got more food available. Because at least that's one apple that's not being sprayed with toxins. So look at ways that you can maximize the energy into your gardens. Plant more plants to help bring in insects. You'll actually find that the more insect diversity that you have, the less pest problems you have. Because you can go out there and collect and solve every single one of your pest problems, but you got a busy life and you're not going to be able to get out there and do it all the time. The best way to do it is to hire other people to do it for you. You do that by planting flowers. Besides, most pesticides aren't even really that effective, and you end up growing super bugs that are resistant to them. There's no bug that can resist having its head torn off by a predator. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you see that we're more than just the bodies that we encompass. We're actually the extension of all the interrelationships with every single creature that we depend on. This apple tree cannot exist without a bee pollinating its flowers, and I can't eat the apple without that bee. So in just 2 levels, I'm directly connected to that bee. And the bees going down is me going down. But nature's way more complicated than that, and we can have interfaces with things that are 50 chains down the line. So in a true Taoist sense, the world is infinitely mystical and beautiful. Go out there and enjoy it. Thanks for watching.